It's a huge subject, and I make no apologies as I sit here and start for telling you that I'm about to tell you a load of lies. I'm going to oversimplify things. I'm going to tell you things that aren't strictly true. But if you know enough to realise that I'm telling you lies, then you know enough to not need me to be telling you the lies in the first place. Right? It's just a weird and wonderful way of working and thinking, but that's what you get when you log into WASAG. So we're going to talk about home networking. Typical home network looks like this. You have devices. Now these will be laptops, tablets, mobile phones. I've included a little circuit board there to represent all the Arduinos and ESP32s and all of that happy bananas. You might even have what the kids these days call a grandpa box, a desktop PC with a keyboard and a big screen and all that good stuff. All sorts of devices. They're all connected using something called fabric. Now that fabric can be Wi-Fi, it can be wires, it can be Ethernet, it can be coax, it can be twisted pairs, it can be any one of a dozen things. And then the fabric will also be connected to something called the router, which I'm going to spend a wee bit of time chatting about in a minute. And then beyond the router, you will find the internet, where my head lives, apparently. Now, there's two areas here. Indoors of the router is called the local area network, and outdoors of the router is called the wide area network. And I'll occasionally drop in LAN or WAN to mean indoors of your house or outdoors of your house. My plan is to go through how this stuff works, some of the terms, all that good stuff. We'll not be talking about fixing it, but that might be another discussion for another day. The router itself, what it does initially and primarily is to route traffic. It takes information and says, oh, that goes out that gate, and that stuff coming in, that goes back out that gate, and that one goes to that gate, and that one comes through, oh, that just goes indoors to the printer. And it basically does like a traffic policeman and works out who can go where and in what order and stuff like that. And when you buy yourself a router, that is right in the core of it. That's right in the center. In order to do that, though, it has to be able to talk to a number of things. Typically, it'll have to talk to wired fabric. So you'll find that if you look at the back of the router, there's a little switch, maybe a 4-channel switch for plugging in Ethernet cables. And it'll also have an access point for talking to the wireless, the Wi-Fi. Most modern ones have got 2 access points because there's 2 standards of Wi-Fi that are currently in use, 2.4 and 5 gigabits per second. So you'll probably have 2 wireless LAN access points. There's then what's called a DSLAM, a digital subscriber line access module, or a bit of electronics for talking to the exchange. Now that can be for fiber, it can be for ADSL, asymmetric digital subscriber line, which is over copper. It's something telecom-y, and we don't have to worry about telecom-y. There's a wee socket. In my house, the socket's in the toilet. It can be quite embarrassing, but there's a wee socket somewhere called a master socket. This gets plugged into the master socket, and you don't have to worry about downstream of the master socket. And you would think that would be all, but no. You want a firewall. Now, in essence, a firewall is simply a piece of software or a piece of hardware that says, if this conversation started indoors, if this conversation started on the LAN, then I will allow packets in both directions to and from whoever this is going to and back to the LAN, and from the LAN to it, and from it to the LAN, and those all get to pass. If the conversation tried to come from outside, where is it? Over there, from outside into the machine, then the firewall drops it. It just doesn't let that packet get any further. And that's basically all a firewall does. You can put holes in the firewall so that certain types of traffic can get in from outside without you inviting them by opening up the connection. But in general, You switch the machine on, it comes up, it has a firewall, and that's all the firewall does. It's a one-way filter. It's almost like a diode in electronics. And then there's Nat and Pat. Now, I think it's either Natalie and Patrick or Nathaniel and Patricia. And the DHCP, these are all to do with numbers. All the information that's going back and forth between any computer, either on the home network or the outside world, has got to do with an address. It's got an associated number called the address. And these two modules are to do with dealing with addresses. I will address them in a few moments' time. Address, good. I forget it. Okay, doing my best here, but I can't even raise a smile. In order to get that to work, you need an internal web server. The router has invariably got a web page that you can connect to adjust it, because all these clever things need settings, and they need the settings to be settable. So you could either take the cover off and bugger about with 100 little jumpers or whatever, or you can connect to its web page. It's got its own little private web page. And most of them also have a USB port on them. And the USB port lets you share a printer or share a disk or share media, share videos, share your music through the USB point. So that's what's in your router. And your router is a throwaway item. I bet you there's hardly anybody in this call that doesn't have one or two of these lying about the house somewhere, because you get them as a giveaway every time you change provider or you upgrade your provider or whatever. And you think, well, that might be useful. Suppose I never need it, so I'll just put it to one side. So we've all got these, and they're full of really interesting high-tech stuff. There's a picture of mine. On the web, remember I said there's a web page, a web interface for mine, and it's got all the bits that I'm using, all in a separate wee box. There's my broadband. There's the internet. There's my address for the WAN. Remember the outside world? There's my outside world address. I've got 4 wired devices connected, 12 Wi-Fi devices connected. DHCP, whatever the hell that is on. And the firewall's on. There's the wireless. It's all there. And basically, as you realise that your router's actually made up of a dozen different modules, it makes sense to look at some of these things. Now, as I said earlier, I'm lying through my teeth when I talk about how a packet is made up, but you're going to have to just live with that. I'm sorry. You asked for this, no me. A packet of information on a network has got a source address where it's coming from, a destination address where it's going to. It's got a whole bunch of octets, a whole bunch of bytes that might be text, they might be binary, they might be anything. And then there's a whole bunch of checksums to make sure that there's no corruption, that there's not been noise, there's not been a clash and all that good stuff. And there's all sorts of clever protocols that I'm not even going to touch on this talk that use those checksums to make sure that if something's not right, that the packet gets flagged as being a dodgy one and then gets resent so that no information is lost. And that's what happens when the thing that Keith was talking about earlier, where suddenly Zoom says you're having internet connectivity problems, it's noticing that it's having to resend a lot of packets, right? It's not measuring your bandwidth, it's measuring how many faulty packets it's seeing. And that's what that's all about. Every address, source address and destination address is a 32-bit number. I'm going to move this good-looking boy across again. Now, a 32-bit number looks like that, 110000001011, etc., etc. Imagine trying to explain that to somebody on the phone when you're trying to set this good stuff up, right? Make you crazy in the head. So we'll try Octal. Octal's easier. These are all the same number, by the way. And in Octal, it's 30.05200, and it's not getting much better. If I convert it to decimal, it's 3.2 something billion. Not getting any better. Even the hex is a bit rough. So what they do is they use decimalized octets. Ooh, what's a decimalized octet, Chiz? Right, if I take 8 bits, those will represent a decimal number between 0 and 255. So that decimal octet there, 11000000, is 128 plus whatever it is, 64, which comes up to 192. And 10101000 comes up to 168. And that comes up to a 1. And that comes up to a 1. So by passing 4 numbers in the range 0 to 255, I can explain a great big horrible binary number. And that's all that when you talk about IP addresses, that's all they are. They're just a great big binary number, and they're expressed in that dot notation to make them easier to talk about, make them easier to see and easier to understand. Now, 32 bits limits us to 4 billion addresses. If you think about it, there's 2 to the power 32 possibles there, and that's 4 billion addresses. Now, a quarter of that's already been given to the United States military, and another great big chunk's been given to the United States government, and there's all sorts of people have got all sorts of chunks of it, so there aren't any spare. The actual internet addresses are very, very rare. The 4 billion isn't going very far. So there's been a couple of solutions applied to try and make the 4 billion addresses go a wee bit further. The first solution is called IPv6, Internet Protocol version 6. 48-bit address instead of a 32-bit address, which gives you 2 to the power 14 possible machines. That'll work because there's never going to be 2 to the power 14. It's getting towards the number of particles in the universe. It's a very, very large number. The only problem is that if we'd wanted to convert the whole of the internet to IPv6, it would break the internet. If they'd started it all IPv6 for day one, then we'd all be using IPv6 and it wouldn't have been a problem. But they haven't, and they would have to change over. And it would be like, you remember when they changed in Sweden, they changed from driving on the left-hand side of the road to driving on the right-hand side of the road. And it was heavy goods vehicles only for the first month, and then the cars changed over to the other side, and it was less than ideal for that month. So that doesn't work. Ports is the next trick. If I have an IP address, then what I do is I apply a colon behind the IP address, and I give it a port number. The port number can be anything from 0 to 65,536. And I can speak on different ports. Now, the problem with that, well, the upside of it, the good side of it is that it gives me 65,000 IP addresses for every IP address that I'm using. The downside of it is if I'm using my IP address on port 200, I can't be using it on port 300 at the same time. It's like a radio, like a 65,000 channel walkie-talkie. You can only be talking in one channel at a time. You can only be using one port at a time. But it is useful. And in order to make it useful, we use this thing called NAT and PAT that I mentioned when I was talking about the router. NAT is network address translation, and PAT is port to address translation. And basically what that does is it takes a whole bunch of different IP addresses, and each with whatever port, and converts them to one IP address with lots of different ports. And I'll show you how that works in a wee minute. They also announced a couple of private subnets. Now, a private subnet is a piece of the IP address range. And that one that I talked about earlier, 192.168.anything, is one of the private subnets. And what that means is that if any router on the internet sees 192.168.anything, it drops it. That shouldn't be here. That's a private address. So you can 192.168 inside your house all day, knowing that if it ever escapes out through your router, the first real router it hits, it'll get dropped. It'll never go anywhere. And similar in the same way, you'll never have anything coming in to a 192.168. It'll always come to a real internet IP address. The other private subnet is 10.0.0. anything. And so if you ever see a 192.168 or a 10.0, you're looking at a private subnet. So move him again. Come on, you good-looking devil, down here. There's my LAN. There's my grandpa box. There's my tablet. There's my mobile phone. And there's an Arduino. And they've all got a different IP address. My router needs to have an IP address. You don't get onto the network unless you've got an IP address, because that address there is the destination when these guys are sending packets. So they have to send packets to some sort of destination, and then the router will decide, do they go back to someplace else, or do they go out to the wide area network, to the greater internet? But what happens, if I can find my next slide, there's Nat and Pat at work. Stuff from that machine, 192.168.1.10, gets sent out on 35:10. On 12 gets sent out on 35:12. And so this one address here is actually sending and receiving for lots of these machines by giving them all a separate port number. Now, those port numbers are just made up. It's not as, I'm sort of making it obvious by making it the port number equivalent to the last digit of the IP address, which is a complete lie. And I'll probably get drummed out in network school for telling you boys that, but I don't care. I've got to that stage in my life that it doesn't matter to me. There will be random numbers assigned here, and Nat and Pat, that piece of software inside the router, keeps a table with all of those addresses and all of those ports, and it keeps juggling that stuff so that it knows who's talking to who. It's very, very clever, this stuff, when you get in among it. Right, next slide, please. And so, there's my house. There's the next house up for me. It's not the next house in this street. I happen to be in an IP. My internet provider is somebody in Lancashire somewhere. So that there might be somebody in Lancashire. It might be somebody else in England. It could be anywhere. But those are all connected to the internet, as is that, which is Merg. When I last looked it up, that's the IP address of Merg. And behind my good-looking self is the IP address of WASAG when I last looked it up. But these numbers are a bit clumsy and a bit lumpy, so we'll have to find a way around about that. Next slide, please. Before I go and talk about how to fix the numbers, we'll have to talk about all these other numbers. If you're mucking about with your home networking, you'll come across this wodge of numbers. Forget DNS, I'll talk about that in a minute. It's IPv6. Remember I said that there's a 6 octet version of the IP available. Most machines have an IPv6 address in case it ever comes through, in case anybody ever starts using it. And so you'll find that if you open up Windows and ask it for it, it's already got an IPv6. There's the IP address of this machine, IPv4, which is the 4 octets. And remember, although it looks like something complicated with dots, that's just a great big 32-bit number. Now, the subnet mask is another 32-bit number. But if you think about 255 is all ones, and 255 is all ones, so that there says that the 192 and the 168 and the 110 are all masked by a 1. And the 132 is masked with all zeros. And that means that the numbers at the end here are on the same subnet as this machine. So this machine knows that it can send to 192.168.110.anything, but it can't send to 192.168.1.anything because .1 isn't in the same subnet. Right? Masking is a trick that you use in electronics. You use ands and ors to mask bits to find out what bits are set and what bits aren't set. And it's a wee bit complex, but all you have to know is that if that last one's a 0, then it's 24 ones, and that last number there are all the machines that you're allowed to talk to. So this machine, which happens to be a grandpa box in my network, can speak to any machine that's got 110.anything. And then the default gateway is, which machine do I send stuff? What destination do I use? Where do I send packets that I want to get out of the network? Remember the router, there's all this stuff on the inside of it over there, and there's one over here to get out. If I want to send stuff to get out, where do I send it? Where's my default gateway to the rest of the planet? And so that's the address of the one machine that I can use to talk to the internet. And that has to be set. If this machine has got that set wrong, it can't speak to the internet. If it's got that set wrong, it might not be able to see other machines in this network. So I have to get those right. And so we come to DNS, or the Domain Naming System. At this point, I'm going to give away my credentials for doing this. I set up and ran college networks for a great many years. I ended up as the head of department for a college technical support department. And I also set up the network in the college. The college had about 5,000 users. It had about 2,000 machines. They were all networked. They were all very, very cleverly interlinked so that a student could go and sit at any machine and log in as himself and get his own stuff. Very, very clever stuff going on there. It took years to learn how to do it and do it. And there was one rule. We used to teach the technicians, you know, a tech would come in, he'd be 20 years of age, he'd never done this stuff. He had to learn it all. And as they learned it all, the first rule we taught them, rule 1, it's always the DNS. The thing that was always wrong, we discovered, when you've got a big, complicated network, when your home network doesn't work, when any network doesn't work, 5 times out of 6, 7 times out of 10, it's the DNS that's wrong. And DNS is a very, very simple thing, but it's not on your router. What it does is it takes a number, gives you back a name, or takes a name, gives you back a number. If I want to connect to bbc.co.uk, I just type in www.bbc.co.uk. I don't have to worry about 245.103. The DNS machine, the first DNS machine that I hit, takes www.bbc.co.uk and feeds me back the IP address of that machine. And after that, the network just does its stuff with IP addresses and everything's great. But the big trouble with DNS is you have to get to a DNS machine, right? And you don't have a DNS machine, but I'll show you a trick in a minute. Your ISP, the person at the far end of your phone line, might have a DNS. There are public DNSs that you can access. You've got to find a DNS machine. Now, if I want to change those numbers, if I want to set up a machine, I try to make this stuff as practical as possible, and it's Windows 10 based, so here we go. I've been doing this my whole life, and I did it manually when I was writing this week. I thought, I'm going to do this. I'll put up an example. And I didn't realize that it takes 8 clicks to get to this stuff. you have to open up this PC, and then at the bottom you have to find the network, and then you have to right mouse that, and then you have to find properties, which is at the bottom again, and then you have to change the adapter settings, and then you have to pick what adapter it is, and then you have to right mouse that to go to its properties, and then you have to find the right protocol, and then you get to adjust it. It's much easier to do than it is to talk about. There's my PC at the top. Down here, I click on the network, change the adapter, pick the adapter, right mouse, properties, there it's there, go to properties and change. And in there, I can change properties. It says there, Chick, you can obtain an IP address automatically. Never told us about that, you bugger. That's okay. That's next. You can also obtain your DNS server automatically. That's useful as well. Talk about that in a minute. Automatic numbers. Let's talk about automatic numbers before I go back to them. Remember I talked about DHCP as being something that's inside your router. DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Control Protocol. What it does is it gives every machine that wants one an IP address. The machine comes on, switches on and says, I don't have an IP address. And it's got that thing that you just saw in the previous slide. Can I go back to the previous slide? Obtain an IP address automatically. It's got that set up, in which case it asks the router, I'd like an automatic number, please. And the router gives it one, plus all them other numbers that I've just been talking about. It gives it its IP address, its default gateway, its subnet mask, its DNS entries, the whole bloody lot. It says, there's all the answers. You're on. And at that machine comes online, which is brilliant. It uses what's called the blockbuster video model, whereby you get a lease, you get the IP address, and as long as you use it, you can keep it. But once you've not used it for maybe 6 hours or 12 hours, it ceases to be yours. You've got to ask for one again. So you've got an IP address for your machine, and it works away. You wander off because you're not using it anymore. And when you come back, if it's within the lease window, the lease gets renewed and you get to use, you keep on with that number and nothing changes. But you switch off and you go away for the weekend. And remember when we used to get to go away for the weekend? No, me neither. You come back and your IP address is different because it was released and you had to get a new IP address. It just gave you a random one. This is really, really easy and really, really cheap to do, and it's done with your router and you don't have to worry about it. However, the address might be different tomorrow. That's a bummer if it's your printer. Your printer's on a different address every time you switch it on. Or it's that big computer that you were using up to recently, and you want to use the drive on it to store all your porn. I mean, to store all those important documents. Then you need to give that an IP address that is static. So when you do that, you have to give it a static IP address. But for most stuff, for the iPad, for the mobile phones, you can give them DHCP and let the other machine, the router, do all the work. So there's the same version brought up both ways. The left-hand side, I filled it in. My IP address, that's the address that this machine is going to use. The subnet mask, that tells this machine that anything that's on the 168.110.anything is on the same network as me. And 1102 is where I have to send packets if I want to talk to the internet. Yep. Now, DNS server. Well, before I get to the DNS, over here, I've left it automatically. And if you've set it automatically, then it gets all that stuff for itself. However, from Windows, I think it was Windows 8, you now also get this spare tab with an alternate configuration. So you can set it to get its IP address automatically when you're sitting in the coffee shop. But when you're home, you want it to have a static IP address. And so you can have two and it will switch between them automatically. If it gets an IP address, it uses it. If it can't get an IP address, it defaults to a static configuration. Right? And you can guess what's behind that alternate configuration. It's just another version of this page here. And you can fill that in using exactly the same thing. That validate settings upon exit, if you tick that wee box, then when you close this, it immediately tries to reconnect to your network and make sure it can speak to the server, and it makes sure it can speak to the internet, and it does all that good stuff, and it gets reconnected. It's actually quite a useful wee box if you're faffing about with your network and you're not really sure if you're connected or not. Pressing that and closing the properties will make it force a reconnection to the internet. Now, DNS. When you were at my college, our college had a DNS server indoors for all the internal names, because everybody knew that we had a certain server that was where all the logins was, and another server was the printers in this room, and another server was the printers in that room, and another server was such and such a staff room. So we had an internal DNS. Most people don't. If your IP provider, your ISP, be it Virgin or BT or whoever, has a DNS server, then you can put it in there. That's a private DNS number that belongs to somebody. And now, if any of you were clever enough and swift enough to write that number down, and I hadn't pockled it, then you could use that DNS server. However, if you go to if you're in, let's say you're in Virgin, and you think, I'm going to use that DNS server of chicks 7744, then you will get to use that. It will use it, but it'll go from your machine to your router to Virgin's routers to about 17 machines down the internet before it finds that. And then it'll send it 17 machines back to you. And your machine will go as slow as the devil, because every time you try to access a network resource, an internet resource, it'll have to go to that machine to find the address. Now, for me, it's the machine that's the other side of my router. So I know that it's going to be really quick for me, which is why I'm using it. If, for some reason, my internet provider is down, then that's not going to be available. So I need an alternate. And it turns out that Mr. and Mrs. Google, in their infinite wisdom, have made the IP address 8.8.8.8 and 8.8.4.4, which are both really hard to remember. They got those IP addresses and they made those available for everybody for a great big super DNS. So I know that if my own DNS dies in its bum, that I'll be able to use Google's super DNS. So I'll always be able to get on the internet, which is why I've got that dialed in as the standby DNS for all my machines. Now, here's how we do this. First of all, I go to my local router. This is the router that you saw the web page of earlier, and there was a wee panel there that said fix the DHCP. And if you fix the DHCP panel, it takes you to here. The DHCP server is on. That's the number of the network, 192.168.1.anything. And I am giving out, if you wander into my house and you put on your phone, you will get a DHCP, an IP address that is somewhere between 100 and 249. And the lease will last 12 hours. And if you want to get DNS action, if you want to contact something on the internet when you're in my house, it will send you to 192.168.1.1, which is my router. Because that way, if you try to connect to the internet and you're inside my house, you're going through my firewall. So that I get to know that you're not contacting something horrible and bringing me a snottery nose in for the internet. So my firewall will hopefully see everything going in and out. And I might have some clever rules set up my firewall to stop bad things from happening. So in order to set this up, I go to the DHCP settings here, and then on the machine, I simply do that thing that we talked about earlier, whereby I say, obtain an IP address automatically. So I've mentioned DNS, I've explained DNS fairly robustly. Your ISP might be able to provide you with DNS, public DNS from Mr. and Mrs. Google. I've explained that. There's those two magic numbers, 8.8.8.8 and 8.8.8.4 are magic numbers that will give you DNS for free from Google. But you also have a secret file on your computer that nobody knows about. And this is for your internal stuff. If you go to C drive Windows System 32 /driver /etc/hosts, you'll find a wee file. And if you upgrade that, there's what it looks like. Now, the first dozen lines or so are all commented out. But below that are all the IP addresses in my house. The routers 192.168.1.1, various security cameras, the radios. I've got half a dozen Raspberry Pi lying about the house doing various businesses. Right, I've got a Raspberry Pi in my pond. How sad is that? What a bloody geek. Somebody write down something about that man. He needs his hard disk looked at. He's got a Raspberry Pi for his pond. Anyway, that means that if I open up a browser and I want to look at the Raspberry Pi for the pond, I just type rpi pond. I don't need to type 192.168. anything. I just type rpi pond. And the computer knows from looking at this page, rpi pond is 192.168.1.80. And so this is my little private internal indoors DNS for getting secret names for my machines. Now, domains, that's an interesting word. A domain is generally somewhere on the internet, like bbc.co.uk, merg.org.uk, OSAG. I've put all them up because they're all fine. And you prepend those domains with the machine name. So if I go to merg.org.uk, that gets me to Merg's router, right? And then beyond Merg's router, there are various machines, one of which is www.merg.org.uk, and that's their web server. Now, as I say, these might all be in the same machine. They might be in machines that aren't actually anything to do with Merg, because Merg's using a provider to provide this service. But logically, that's how it works. The first part of a web domain is the name of the machine. So that there might be www.merg.org.uk. There might be ftp.merg.org.uk. There might be login.merg.org.uk. There might be porn.merg.org.uk. There could be anything, but these are all separate machines, right? And you can have the same inside your house. Like I had the same inside the college. But if you're going to have a domain inside the house, then you're going to have domain servers. You're going to have logins. You're going to have access control lists. What person can access what materials when they're logged in at which machine. And you need infrastructure to do that. You need a rack of servers to do that groovy stuff. So to make that easier, they invented this concept called a work group. And if you put half a dozen machines up inside your house, then there'll be this peer-to-peer network set up called a work group. And it calls itself work group. You can change it if you've got delusions of adequacy and you want to change everything to whatever you want to call it. But it doesn't make any difference. I've found it's much cheaper to just leave it as work group, because that way anybody that logs into the house, if somebody comes to my house and logs in, then their machine will probably be on work group as well. And so if their machine's got work group, they can log into my work group and they can see my printers and my servers and stuff like that. It makes sharing easily. The only problem that it brings to the party is that it's now two uses for the word domain. Domain as in an internet domain, and domain as in all the computers inside your network. They both have the same word for them, but they mean different things, right? So I had to kind of clear that one up. So when do we finally get to play with the toys? Now we're going to talk about some of the toys. I'm going to show you half a dozen of these. They're all built into Windows. All you need to do is open a command line and you can play with these. Right, and I'll show you what they work, what they do approximately, and give you an idea of what they're for. All of these things, if you type the name of it, and then instead of typing anything after it, if you type the name of it and nothing, it'll do the very, very basics for you. None of them will do anything destructive. You can't hurt anything with these boys. You can use them to see what's going on for diagnostic purposes, but there's nothing here that can break anything. Maybe net. Net can break things, but you're not going to break things with net, because you need to be particularly perverted to start breaking things with net. If you want to know how to use them more robustly than what I'm explaining, then you just put the name of it, like ping, question mark, hyphen question mark, and it'll give you all the possible uses and a couple of examples on how to do it. So you can get to extend your knowledge without me having to go through them all on here. So let's move on. Ipconfig is a copy of the Unix ifconfig. On Unix, there's a command called interface configuration, ifconfig, and it's so useful that Microsoft stole it. It lets you alter your Ethernet configurations. It lets you see what IP address you've got, what subnet mask, and what all that good stuff you've got. The usual one you do is ipconfig/all, which gives you all the information, but it can also control DHCP. If you want to set a new lease and you want to get rid of your lease on DHCP, you can do it with this. There's an example of it. I simply typed ipconfig and it gives me the current IP configuration, the name, local domain, the addresses, all that stuff we talked about earlier. There's nothing new to see there. Ping is a wonderful wee command. It's the one you use most when you're debugging and troubleshooting networks. And ping says, send a packet to that machine and that machine will respond. So if I get a machine up and is it working, the first thing I'll do is I will ping the router. I will type ping space router or ping space 192.168.1.1, which is the address of my router, right? And it will send a simple handshake. There's a packet and it bounces back a very, very similar packet within a couple of milliseconds. The target should respond. However, if you're the BBC or NASA or the government, and you've got millions of people interested in your site, you might not want thousands of these packets arriving every second for all these students all over the world that are learning to use this. So you might turn ping off so that your server ignores pings. But for the most part, most machines do respond to ping. So here they are. I pinged www.merg.org, right? Not, you might note, www.merg.org.uk. It's a different group, right? So dnsmerge.org and found me that number. I wonder who these people are. And then it sent 4 little packets and got 4 replies, and it gives me, there you are. It takes you an average of 20 milliseconds, just over a 50th of a second to get a packet to and from this merge.organisation, whoever they are. They sound to me like people that are living in an island that's made out of a hollowed out volcano, but that's just the way I think. Traceroute is Ping's big brother. And again, it's a copy of the Unix traceroute command. Does the same stuff. It sends a DNS request. Where is this thing? It then sends a series of pings. But what it does is it says, oh, 12 pings to get to that machine. So it then sends another ping, but only allows that ping to go 11 hops and says, how far did you get? And then it sends a ping 10 hops. How far did you get? And then sends a ping, 9 hops, 8 hops, 7 hops. And doing that, it compiles a list of all the machines between your machine and the machine you targeted, the machine you aimed at. So you can find out who you are. Now, at this point, I trace routed to merge.org.uk. And it's a completely different IP address. See it? I'm going to go back a couple. 185.146 plays 76.223. These are completely different organizations on completely different sides of the internet. So, traceroute, the name of the site I'm aiming at, it works out the IP address of the target, and then it says 1 millisecond to get to my, that's my router there. 25 milliseconds later, it's at my IP provider. 26 milliseconds to get out. 25 milliseconds to get to the London Exchange, and so on. Euro Access, NLSD, that's a hosting company, A2 Web Hosting, and that's where Merge are hosted. Now, if I was nefarious and hackery and I wanted to have a go at hacking the Merge website, I'd now know where I was going for a hack. But obviously I don't, and I would never tell you guys how to do stuff like that, because that would be illegal and immoral and knowing my luck fattening. Net is the biggie. Net's been with Microsoft since Windows for Workgroups, Windows 3.11. And over the years, it has morphed. They've added more and more and more and more to it. And I could sit here for 2 hours. I could sit here for 2 days talking about the stuff that Net does. So I'm not going to. I've left it. If you want to have a dig through it, you can have a dig through it. But there's the start. You can do net accounts, net computers, net config, which configures your network, net file, net group, net share a machine in your network, start and stop network machines, start and stop network services. There's 1,000 things that this can do. I'll show you a couple of them just here. Net users. I am on a machine called M4800. If that doesn't make much sense, it's a Dell M4800 laptop, which is why it's called M4800, so I know what machine it was. And I asked it for users. There's 2 users in this machine, the administrator, who is Chick and is the default account, and there's a guest account in this machine, which is a utility account if somebody wants to come into that machine for some legitimate purpose. Right? In order to do that, I have to have set up permissions for that, which is maybe something we'd have to do. We have to talk about some other time. And then on the same machine, I immediately type net use. Look, that's users, and this is net use. And it says, yeah, there's a thing called N drive, which is a machine that's sharing media. So I've got a machine on my network that is sharing media. It's got all the movies and all the music and all that good stuff on it. And it's on any machine in my house. If you go to the N drive, you'll find that there's all the movies and all the albums and all that good stuff is on the N drive. For every machine in the house, it's shared. And that's how I do it with NetUse. I'll explain that a wee bit more detail in a minute or two. App. Remember I said I was vastly simplifying things. Well, I'm going to desimplify something now. Everything's got an address. 192.168.something.something. We all understand that. And the addresses are either given to it by me typing or they get them from the router. Fine. How does the router know which machine has got which address? There has to be some way of mapping IP addresses to physical hardware, to actual network cards or wireless routers or little dongles. And that's done by a thing called address or resolution protocol. Every device that is capable of sustaining an IP address. So your current laptop sitting in front of you has got an Ethernet port, a Wi-Fi port, another Wi-Fi port, and a Bluetooth connection, 4 different possible IP addresses. So it's got 4 ARP addresses. The ARP address is 24 bits of manufacturer code. So the first 6 digits as you read it are who made it. And again, you can look these up. Oh, that's a Dell one. That's an IBM one. That's an HP one. And then there's a serial number, which is just a random number, which is what number it was when it came off the production line. But you don't need to know it. But it's nice if you actually do know it, then you can see if it's the right machine that's talking to you from its ARP address. The only problem is that if you think about all the machines in the internet and all the machines in your own network, there's billions of them. And if it kept all that information, it would swamp the machine. And it doesn't need all that information. It only needs the information for the machines it's talking to. So what it does is it keeps a cache of all the machines it's seen in the last 20 minutes. So if you do ARP/A, which is the command to show me all the ARP addresses, then there's all the addresses that this machine knows, and there's the physical address associated with them. And these 224s and 239s, these are broadcast addresses. They're special addresses at special places. Remember I said, oversimplifying again, that there's private subnets that you're not allowed to use. Well, those are another couple of ones that you're not allowed to use because they're used inside your network to broadcast. If I'm going to send a message saying, who's got such and such an address, I could send it to all 2,000 machines on my network, and that would take 5 minutes. Or I could send out a single broadcast to everybody at the same time. And whoever the one person that's got it sends me back the answer. And that's much quicker. And that's a broadcast message. Right now, I haven't discussed broadcast messages at all in home network because you don't have to worry about them. But that's what these are. These are broadcast people that have been sending out broadcast messages on my network. So you don't have to worry about that any further. And so we move on to the protocols for using the home network. I'm only going to talk about 2 or 3 of these because it only takes a couple of minutes to explain it. It's really quite straightforward. You'll find references to things like NetBIOS and WINS and other things there that essentially no longer exist. When Microsoft did this wonderful thing whereby everything that they stumble across, they decide that they invented it. And the same with networking. Up until Windows 3.1, you couldn't get a network in a Windows machine. And then they brought out Windows 3.1, Windows for Workgroups with built-in networking. We've invented networking. You're all going to love this. But you have to use the Microsoft protocols. And they put in all these Microsoft protocols for making machines talk to each other and all that. There was a perfectly good suite of protocols there that have been getting used for 1,000 years since the start of the internet, 10 years earlier. And they decided, no, we've got to invent, these have got to be Microsoft ones. We own these, so we can change these, and you have to follow us and give us your money to get using them and all that happy stuff. And one of the big rules of the internet is if the internet sees something it doesn't like, it just roots round about it. And the internet just rooted right round about Microsoft and their net BIOS and their wins and all that cack. But by that time, Microsoft had left it inside the Microsoft product, and they can't no longer support it. They can't say, oh, forget that. Scrub round that. We never really invented that. We never put that in, because there's lots of very heavy hitting US military people are using those protocols now, and they don't want them just going away. So they have to remain there, but nobody uses them. Nobody in the real world uses them. So you'll find a lot of these net BIOSes and wins and things that you really don't have to worry about. Windows sharing, you do need to worry about. Samba is how Unix machines, internet machines share stuff. I'll show you that. And Sftp, which is particularly relevant on the 12th of July. And they had a bonfire fall in their house this past weekend. We'll talk about that as well. Moving on. Windows sharing is complicated. It's more complicated than it has to be. It's much more complicated than doing it with Unix or Linux or a Raspberry Pi or anything else. Before you embark upon it, you have to switch on something called network discovery, which is a secret that nobody's told you. I'm certainly not telling you it because I've got to bother. You also need to switch on file and printer sharing. If you try to do it without doing those, you'll get some weird and wonderful dialogue comes up saying, you've not turned these things on. Do you want to turn them on now? And you say, yes. And it goes away. And you think you've turned them on, but you haven't. So you've then got to go and do it. In order to do it, you go back to this PC, you go back to network at the bottom of the left-hand panel, you go back to properties, you find advanced sharing settings, you turn on network discovery, you turn on file and print sharing. So there we are, this computer, network, right mouse, properties, advanced sharing. And when you click on it, up comes change sharing options. Right? Now, that's set for private because everything in my network's private. If you set that for public, then anybody that's logged into your network can see all your shares. Everything that's on my machine is private anyway, but that's down to you. You have to turn on discovery, you have to turn on sharing, and then you have to save the changes. I've had to fix a number of machines for people where they've been in here, clicked on that, and then automatically pressed cancel. And it hasn't taken because they didn't save the changes. So in order to share, let's say a drive, I first of all go to the machine where I want to share the drive. If I've got, like I say, that big machine with the big hard drive on it, and I want to share all the videos and pictures that are on it, for example, now I've got to go and set up that machine first. I go to that machine, I turn on sharing, as I just talked about. I also have to go and turn on permissions for the users, and these are for the drive. Apart from turning on sharing in general, which you just saw me do, I've now got to go and turn on sharing and change the permissions for the drive that I want to share. Show us how to do that, chick. Yes, of course, there it's there. On the machine that I'm going to serve, I'm going to share the C drive. So I go to the properties of the C drive. And first of all, I go to sharing. And I have to, it's not shared. In order to share it, I have to go into advanced sharing. And there I can say, share this drive and call it my porn or whatever I want to call it. And then I come back out here, once I've applied that, I come back out and I go to security. This is the one that people forget. And I've got to say who can use this share. I can share it, but if Chick's not allowed access to that, then that's a problem. Now, that brings me back to another issue here. It's much, much easier if you have got the same name in all your machines. If I've got a machine from 10 years ago and it says college work, if I log into it as college work, if I share that, then it becomes shared as college work, and I have to log in using my college work login to get access to it. Whereas if I'm now, I haven't been at college for a decade because I retired. So if I'm now logging in as Chick, it'll then say, what are your credentials to get in here? And I've got to provide the name of an account that it knows and the login password for the account that it knows. So it makes much more sense to go around all the machines in your network and make sure that you've got an account on all the machines that's got the same name and the same password. If you put a different password on every one, then you're going to drive yourself mental trying to remember all these passwords. So you have to make sure that you use identical passwords, identical accounts on all the machines. Now, if this was a network security seminar, we'd be screaming at the very prospect of using the same account and the same login on all your machines. But it's not, it's on the machines inside your house. You should be doing something like that. Similarly, if it's a shared machine, if you're sharing a printer or you're sharing a drive, you don't put DHCP on it, or it keeps coming up with different IP addresses and it can never get found. Much, much better to give it a static address and put that address inside, remember the etc. hosts file, so that it knows where to find it. So I can just type in my porn and it knows that's 192.168.1.12 and it can always go there as it has to. So let's kind of talk about the details of that. Now that I'm on the machine that I want to actually get the share on, this is where I want to see the shared stuff. This is what's called the client machine. I open this PC and there are two buttons up there. That one there is to share something on the LAN. Remember the LANs over there, and the LANs over there? Yep, the LANs outside the router on the internet, the LANs inside the router on my house network. That there is the LAN stuff. So if I press that button, I can share something that is on my network. If I want to share something on somebody else's computer out in the internet, then I can do that there as well. But I have to have permissions and I have to have an account on that machine. Exactly the same way as I have to have permissions and I have to have an account on the machine in my house if I'm going to use it. But if, for example, we decided to share all the Dropbox stuff, we could make it such that you could just share it there. And you could actually share all the Dropbox stuff by clicking on that button. This third button I'll discuss in a wee minute. That's simply for media. So I've decided I want to, let's go back a wee bit. I want to map something on the LAN. I can either say I want N drive to be shared storage / media, reconnect at startup. Remember I said you might have to log in with different credentials. If I click that button there, then it'll start prompting me for what's your account in this machine, and what's your name in this machine, and what's your password in this machine. And life is already too short and brutal to be having to do that. So that's why I was explaining that way. And if I don't have my local DNS set up, then what I can do is I can simply type 192.168.1, the IP address. You can always find things with IP address, and that way you're not depending on the DNS, because it's always the DNS that goes wrong. You should all repeat that after me. It's always the DNS that's wrong. Windows Media Devices, these are smart televisions, internet radios, Bluetooth speakers, Alexa, all that good stuff that are using Windows Media Shares. They already come set up. Setting one of those up is a pain, and it's usually done in a Raspberry Pi Linux environment. It's not for us setting up here, and it's certainly not one that I'm going to go into in any great detail. Usually you switch the TV on and it wakes up with a media server set up, or you buy a digital radio, switch it on, and it's got a media server set up. It'll ask you, do you want DHCP or do you want to put in a static address? And you do that and you're online, and away we go. And those take us to that third button. There we go. Down here, it will turn up simply as a server on your network. Network locations, that's a ready NAS, whatever that is. Well, I'll tell you what a ready NAS is in a wee minute. That's a computer. That's that server that I just connected to, and that's a digital media server. And I set those up by going to the third button. Remember, that's the LAN, that's the WAN. Those are for digital media, separate animal. Again, made so that it's very easy for consumers simply to set this thing up and get it going with a minimum of technical support. Now, Samba is how Unix does file sharing. Right? It's actually called SMB NMB, but everybody calls it Samba. And it's file sharing for Unix machines. And it's used in lots of NAS devices. NAS is short for nasty. No, it's not. It's network attached storage, and it's something like that. It's a wee box that plugs into your network, has a couple of drives that stores a lot of stuff on it, and it's like a vault for keeping all your software or keeping all your videos or doing whatever it is you do. Windows will automatically connect to those entirely happily. It's really good at connecting to them. However, if you've got an older one, then it doesn't use the most recent version of Samba. The Samba protocol is currently at version 2. There was a version 1 and a version 1.1, and they were great, but they weren't secure. Right? Their security was compromised. So if you've got one of these, Windows isn't going to let you just connect to it because there's a security risk there. However, it's not difficult to connect to it. Type Windows Features down in the magic corner there, and it'll give you the option to turn Windows Features on and off. Turn Windows Features on and off will give you the option. I'm going to move that good looking fella down there. Or maybe squeeze his box a wee bit. There we go. Turn Windows Features on and off, and you can enable Samba 1 or CIFS or whatever support. You can also switch other things on here. I'll leave that to you to play with, but only change one thing at a time because you might break something important. But if you turn on the SMB1, then suddenly that old NAS that you've got lying about will work absolutely fine. Right, FTP and SFTP. File Transfer Protocol was the original file transfer protocol between machines on the old internet back in the days before the World Wide Web. Before the World Wide Web, you could log into each other's machines and copy stuff down off each other's machines and put things up in each other's machines. And it was basically text only or binary only, and it wasn't secure. So after a wee while, it was superseded by a new version called Secure FTP. However, to write an FTP server only takes about 400 bytes of C code. It's really, you can write tiny FTP servers. So if I'm building some wee gizmo and I want to put signals into it or out of it, some wee consumer gizmo, like, oh, I don't know, a Sprog, for example, or a DCC controller, or an EasyBus Uno, and I want to have a way of putting files on and off of it. A big file transfer, one of the big modern ones that's secure, there's not room for that, along with whatever the machine is trying to do in the first place. But I can squeeze a tiny FTP server in there. So for that reason, FTP still gets used, and it gets used in a lot of gizmos and a lot of devices. So it's worth knowing about FTP. The other thing about FTP is that it's been round about available since Moses was a children. Since Cain and Abel fought in Blantyre, there's been FTP. And so everybody knows all the commands for FTP, and they haven't changed, and they're not allowed to change because it would break all the FTP installs all around about the world. And so what happens is a lot of things that you use have got FTP built into them for letting you connect to machines. So first of all, I'll show you how FTP works. You type FTP on your machine and it takes you into a command prompt. And there's all these wonderful commands. Connect to this machine, disconnect to that machine, open a connection, close a connection, give me help for the local machine, change the directory on the local machine, print what directory I'm on in the local machine, print what directory I'm on in the remote machine. All this stuff, I can actually use the file system on two machines at the same time, and I can copy stuff between them with all these commands. Now, what I did was I didn't know if my own media server had an FTP thing on it, so I tried it, and it said, no, you're not getting in there. So at that point, I said, right, quit, and it kicked me back out. But it's a wee command line environment, and you can go in there and explore if you want to use FTP for whatever nefarious purposes. Where I do use it is this. I use Total Commander for transferring stuff back and forth between machines, and it will let me connect via FTP to another machine. So I can do that and connect to a machine in a different room, or a machine in a different building, or a machine on the other side of the internet, and copy stuff back and forth as if it's two panels on my own machine. So it's really, really useful for that. Now, I talked about this last week, and that's the fact that you can now use the web to share data. This is the one-liner that we did last week. If you have Python on a machine, you can simply type Python -m, which means I'd like you to run a module, and the module is called HTTP server. HTTP is the name of the hypertext protocol. That's the web. So that says Python run a module called web server, and you're going to use port 8000. Remember I said the channel's on my walkie-talkie? Well, that's channel 8000. And at that point, it starts serving on that. The current directory gets served up on that address, on that port, and I can log into it from a different machine. As I explained last week, this is really, really useful if you've got a Kindle or an iPad that's first or second generation and it doesn't have an SD card and you can't get stuff into it. My Apple iPads and the original Kindles didn't have a way of putting stuff onto them. You could buy stuff for Amazon or Apple or whoever, and they'd put stuff on for you. but you wanted to put your own stuff on, no, not verboten. But what you can do is simply put up a web server on your computer or your laptop and then download stuff off your laptop onto your Kindle, onto your iPad without it having any kind of connection to do that. And it's a cheap, easy way of sharing data. I talked more about that last week, so I'm going to kind of brush past it. We're nearly finished because I'm going on for hours and hours and hours. There are 3 sets of third-party tools that I would recommend to you. There are thousands of hacker tools. If we want to go on and do more detailed stuff on this, I'm happy to do that. And I can talk about all the wee hacky tools that are out there, all the Nmaps and Zenmaps and Ncats and all these things. But these 3 I thoroughly recommend. Putty is a suite of tools that I'll show you in a minute. Nirsoft, I mentioned Nirsoft a couple of times when we're talking about the USB thing, and they've got a complete suite of network tools for letting you discover networks and copy stuff between networks and log into remote networks and do all that stuff. Nirsoft's great for that. And system internals, that was a wonderful set of tools as well that was up on the internet, and it was so successful that Windows bought it, and now it's now Windows systems internals, and you can get those from Microsoft for free, and they've got dozens and dozens and dozens of tools for doing all sorts of clever grooviness. Talking about ping, not ping, sorry, talking about putty. There's putty. You can pick a machine, there's the list of machines, and you can click the machine, connect to it, and basically it brings up a panel on that machine. And you're on that machine and you can do all the stuff that you would do normally on that machine as you would. There's also a Windows version of this where you can get a window on the remote machine called VNC for Virtual Network Command, VNC, if you want to do that. So I'm finished. Where do we go from here? We might want to talk about troubleshooting your home network and how to do that. I kind of breezed over the fact that you need to have permissions, either access control lists or cascading access control. There's a whole topic there that might be worth talking about one of these days. I did a thing up at Shawlands years ago about running a virtual network over your layout and using ESP8266s and ESP32s to run station destination boards and signals and even points, animations, simply as little standalone remote wireless instances without physically connecting them. That might be worth visiting again. Some of those other web services, I've shown you how to use a web service, but there's 100 other things there we could talk about. Or I'm open to ideas for anybody else that thinks, having listened to me chunter on for the last hour and a bit, what else they'd like to talk about. Any questions, please, if the floor's open.